Snow falls differently on a quiet December night. Inside, the air is warm and thick with smells you know by a heart. Wood smoke curling from a distant chimney. Cinnamon and orange peel simmering somewhere in a kitchen. Pine and wax from a crowded Christmas tree. Maybe there's a pie in the oven, or a sweet bread rising on the counter. Somewhere, a mother or a grandmother is moving through these rituals without thinking, repeating the same motions her hands have known since you were small. Children are out in the snow, scarves crooked, cheeks red. They knock at doors with gloved fists and sing carols they only half remember, their voices wobbling on the high notes. Someone laughs, someone shushes them, someone presses sweets or tangerines into their mittened hands. The lights in the windows are warm and golden, small defiant suns pinned to the longest nights of the year. For most of us, this is Christmas, a season of soft lights and familiar songs, a brief pocket of time where the world seems to agree just for a moment to be gentle. It is easy, in that glow, to believe that it has always been this way. But if you peel back that warmth just a little, another picture begins to emerge. A picture that belongs not to Coca-Cola Red and shopping mall Santas, but to the older, harder winters our ancestors knew, nights when the snow was not a decoration, but a threat, when darkness lasted long enough to feel personal, when every sound outside the walls might be hunger or wolves or something worse. Before there were fairy lights, there were bonfires. Before there were Christmas trees strung with glass ornaments, there were branches hung with charms to keep spirits away. And before there was one jolly man in red making his silent rounds, there was a crowded, dangerous company of beings who walked the winter nights. Hunters in the sky, horned demons in the streets, ogres on the mountainside, ghostly horses at the door, witches checking your work, goblins crawling up from under the world. In the oldest layers of Christmas lore, before Santa Claus, these monsters ruled the winter. Their stories were not written as entertainment. They were warnings and explanations, survival manuals disguised as tales. They turned the cold itself into characters you could name, bargain with, fear, and maybe, if you were very careful, appease in a history of Christmas that reaches back past cathedrals and carols into forests and longhouses. These figures are the first to step out of the dark. Later, when Christianity spread through Europe and the church began to shape the calendar, the old festivals didn't simply vanish. They bent, shifted, changed their clothing. The hidden history of Christmas is not just about dates and doctrines. It is about what happened to those winter beings when the new stories arrived, how some were driven underground, how others were tamed, how a few quietly slipped their masks and reappeared at the side of a saint in bishop's robes, or a kindly grandfather with a sack of gifts. Tonight, we're going to walk out into that older winter. We'll start in the silence, just beyond the firelight, where the snow hides footprints and the sky feels a little too close. We'll follow the wind into the mountains of the Alps, where a horned figure rattles his chains through narrow streets, will climb the slopes of Iceland to the cave of an ogress who listens for the sound of children's feet. Will peer up into the storm clouds for riders whose hooves never touch the ground. Will hear the knock of bone on wood as a horse skull demands to be let in to sing. This isn't quite a very pagan Christmas, and it isn't quite a church service either. It lives in the space between, a crossroads where fear and celebration, darkness and light, punishment and gifts all meet around the same winter fire. The snow still falls. The world is still muffled. The pie is still baking. But as you sit with that warmth around you, imagine that outside your window the night is not empty. Imagine that for centuries people believed that something was passing by, listening to songs, checking on behavior, counting spun wool, sniffing out laziness, peering into windows with eyes that glowed like embers. This is the season when people once said the border thinned, between the living and the dead, between the safe indoors and the wild outside, between the human world and whatever waited just beyond the circle of light. This is where our story begins, not with Santa on a rooftop, but with the world before him, a world where winter belonged to fear as much as joy, and where the figures of December were not all kind. Because to understand why we tuck children into bed with stories of a benevolent gift giver, you have to understand who walked there first. You have to meet the monsters of winter. Long before anyone marked December 25th on a calendar, people knew the feeling of the longest night. They didn't calculate it with apps or printed charts. They felt it in their bones and in their work. The sun dragging itself reluctantly over the horizon, then dropping again before the day had properly begun, shadows that seemed to start at mid-afternoon, fields frozen and silent, rivers edged with ice, animals growing thinner, neighbors' faces growing sharper with hunger and worry. In our time, we insulate ourselves from that reality. Central heating hums in the background. Grocery stores fill their shelves, no matter the season. If the wind howls outside, we put on a playlist and drown it out. Winter is an aesthetic now, a filter, a scent, a seasonal display. For the people who first created what we now call Christmas lore, winter was something else entirely. It was a test. In Northern Europe, the months around the winter solstice could decide who lived to see the spring. A failed harvest meant thin gruel stretched too far. A sickness spreading through a cramped house could take the oldest and the youngest in a single week. A storm at the wrong moment could trap people in their homes or drive them out into cold they weren't prepared to face. There were no weather reports promising that it would clear by morning. Only the sound of wind in the dark, and the knowledge that the next weeks might be harder than the last. When people live under that kind of pressure, they rarely leave the season empty and shapeless. They give it a face. It's easier to say, the spirits are angry, then we did not understand the climate. Easier to believe something walks tonight than sometimes bad things happen for no reason at all. Monsters, gods, witches, ancestors, they're all ways of wrapping chaos in a story so that you can talk to it. So winter became crowded. In the deep imagination of Europe, December and January were never just rows of cold days. They were populated with beings who moved when the sun did not. Some roamed the sky, riders with cloaks whipping behind them, hounds leaping, hooves that never touched the ground. Others prowled the forests and the mountains, watching for lights in cottage windows. Some slipped under doors or peered down chimneys. Others walked openly in processions through the village, wearing masks and antlers, fur and bells, reminding everyone that the border between human and other was thin this time of year. These beings had jobs. They punished laziness. They inspected spinning and weaving, those winter tasks that kept a household clothed. They counted how much bread had been shared, and how much hoarded. They frightened children into staying close to the hearth and out of dangerous snowdrifts. They marked the year's end with a kind of supernatural accounting. Who had worked, who had wasted, who had given, who had taken. In some cultures, this took the form of formal judgment. Lists of good and bad children are not a modern invention. They just used to come with more claws. In others, the beings were less judges and more reminders. A rider in the sky, whose hunt might sweep up anyone wandering alone at night, is an excellent excuse to stay indoors. A monstrous cat that eats those who didn't receive new clothes is at heart a story about solidarity, ensuring that even the poorest receive something, so they're not marked as prey. All of this sat alongside the more familiar solstice rituals we now recognize from a history of Christmas. Fires lit to coax the sun back, evergreen branches brought inside to show that life still persisted. Feasts held even in lean times to prove that fear hadn't won. Light and darkness shared the same season. So did comfort and threat. The Church Fathers, who later shaped the Christian calendar, understood this on some level. They weren't stepping into a blank space and writing Christmas on it. They were stepping into a season already heavy with meaning, already haunted by its own cast of characters. If there is a hidden history of Christmas, it lies in that negotiation. How do you preach hope in a time of year when people already believe that the sky is full of riders and the snow is full of teeth? One answer was to change the story. Another was to keep some of the old stories but give them new names. Over time, certain traits begin to repeat. A bearded figure who moves through the winter sky, watching over behavior. Companions who reward and punish visits to houses at night, gifts left behind, threats muttered in the dark. It's not hard to see how tales of Odin's wild rides or local household spirits might, centuries later, blur into the idea of a single man making a yearly journey with a sack over his shoulder. But before that smoothing over happened, the monsters were many. For the people living with them, they were not cinematic villains. They were explanations, warnings, sometimes even protectors. To tell a child that someone is looking in the window is frightening. To tell that same child that if they listen, if they help, if they share, that being will pass them by or leave something behind. That's a way of teaching survival skills in a world without safety nets. In that sense, the phrase "a very pagan Christmas" isn't just about bonfires and offerings under trees. It's about a season where the stories were honest about how brutal life could be, and where the visitors of winter represented that honesty. They said, "The world is dangerous, and what you do matters." Tonight, as we walk further into this landscape of snow and story, keep that in mind. These creatures are strange and sometimes horrifying, but they are also mirrors of the fears and hopes of the people who invented them. They walked the same frozen paths, heard the same wolves, saw the same pale sun. And in their minds, the winter sky was rarely empty. If the wind rose suddenly and rattled the shutters, it might not just be a storm. It might be hooves. It might be the first sound of a hunt. Imagine a winter storm so fierce that it feels alive. The wind doesn't just push at the house, it claws at it. The snow doesn't fall neatly from above. It whirls sideways, stinging, erasing the world beyond a few meters. The sky is a roiling, shifting thing, full of shapes you can't quite pin down. You hear something that might be branches rubbing together, but it might also be hooves. You tell yourself it's only thunder, but it doesn't quite sound like thunder. It sounds like shouting. It sounds like barking. It sounds like something passing over you at incredible speed. For the Germanic and Norse peoples, that sound had a name. They called it the Wild Hunt. Across a wide swath of northern Europe, from the North Sea to the deep forests of Germany and the British Isles, people spoke of a spectral procession that rode through the winter sky. Its leader had different names in different regions: Odin, Woden, other local spirits and gods, but the idea was the same. During the darkest time of year, a company of the dead and the divine swept across the world, hunting, howling, passing judgment. In some stories, the Wild Hunt chased souls, the spirits of the unquiet dead or those who had died violently. In others, it pursued game across the sky: ghostly deer, boars of mist, beasts no one had ever seen in daylight. Sometimes it was an omen of war or plague. Sometimes it was simply a sign that the boundary between worlds had grown thin. Always, it was dangerous. You did not go out when the hunt rode. You stayed indoors, lamps low, doors bolted, children hushed. If you heard the horns and the hooves and the baying of spectral hounds, you crossed yourself, or before that, made the sign you hoped would keep you safe, and waited for it to pass. In some regions, people left offerings outside: bread, ale, bits of meat. Perhaps the riders would take those and leave the house alone. Perhaps, like many beings of winter, they could be bargained with. At the center of many of these stories was Odin, not the neat, distant god of later retellings, but the older, wilder figure, a one-eyed traveler with a long beard, a cloak that hid his shape, and a hat pulled low over his face. He was the All-Father, yes, but also a lord of the dead, a god of battle and hanging and runes. He sought wisdom in dangerous places and often walked the world disguised, testing hospitality and courage. During the Yule season, Odin was said to ride out at the head of the Wild Hunt, mounted on his eight-legged horse Sleipnir. 8 legs meant he could cover vast distances. It also made him something strange, half in this world and half in another. His hounds, or accompanying spirits, bayed through the storm. Sometimes lightning itself was imagined as the flash of his spear. This image, a bearded figure in winter, riding across the sky, visiting the world of humans unseen, is one of the oldest layers in the sediment of a history of Christmas. You can see why storytellers, centuries later, would draw from it when they reshaped winter into something more domesticated. Swap the horse for reindeer, the hunt for a gift-giving journey, the dangerous god for a kindly saint, and you begin to feel the outline of a familiar silhouette. But in the older stories, Odin's ride was not comforting. Children were told not to look out if they heard the hunt. To see it might mean illness or misfortune in the year ahead. Travelers caught in a storm might be warned that they risked being swept up and carried far from home, waking alone in the snow with frostbite nipping at their fingers. And yet, there was an element of hope as well. In some tales, those who honored the old ways might receive Odin's protection during the Yule nights. Offerings left out, food, straw for Sleipnir, a cup of strong drink, could be rewarded. Especially clever children sometimes left treats in boots or shoes, hoping that the passing rider would notice and leave something in return, a small toy, a coin, a sign that they had been seen and judged worthy. Here, in this shifting space between terror and favor, you can feel how the imagination prepares the way for later figures. A visitor who rides the winter sky, a mysterious judge, gifts and punishments tied to behavior, a house that is both vulnerable and blessed when he passes overhead. Long before anyone talked about a hidden history of Christmas, long before anyone tried to explain the holiday's pagan roots, people simply told these stories because the wind howled and the snow fell, and they needed to make sense of the noise above their heads. The Wild Hunt is not just a myth about gods. It is a myth about storms. It gives shape to the roar of winter. It lets you imagine that the chaos has a leader, a direction, a purpose. If something is in charge of the storm, maybe you can appease it. Maybe in the end, it is on your side. So in those old longhouses and farmsteads, as the wind rattled the thatch, and the smoke from the hearth curled up into the rafters. People spoke of Odin riding. Children listened with wide eyes, clutching blankets over their noses. Adults listened too, perhaps pretending to be braver than they felt outside. The storm raged. Inside, the story made its own kind of weather. Centuries later, when Christianity had spread and the wild hunt had begun to fade from official belief, the echoes remained. Some of those echoes drifted into the stories of saints, into the figure of a bishop who traveled in December and rewarded good behavior. Others sank deeper into the soil, lingering in folk tales about riders no one should watch, about processions of the dead seen on certain nights of the year. In that sense, when we talk about Christmas lore today, we're not just talking about nativity scenes and elves. We're talking about the lingering shadows of those riders still moving somewhere behind the modern picture, the idea that winter has a patrol, that someone is out there taking note. As the wild hunt passes overhead in our story, the snow in the village below falls quietly. Doors stay shut. Fires burn low. And somewhere, in a small house, pressed between others for warmth, a child lies awake, listening. They will never see the riders, but they will grow up knowing that the winter sky is not empty, and that knowledge will shape the monsters who follow. In certain Alpine towns, the first week of December does not belong to gentle carols. It belongs to chains. They drag along cobblestones, clatter over frozen ground, crash against wooden doors. Bells jangle with a frantic, uneven rhythm. There is stomping, shouting, a low animal howl. Torches flare in the night, throwing shadows into wild shapes on the walls. Children press themselves against their parents' legs, torn between terror and fascination. Through the smoke and the cold comes a shape that looks like every warning made flesh. Tall, horned, fur matted with imagined centuries of snow and soot. A tongue that lolls too long from a gaping mouth full of teeth. On his back, a basket or a sack large enough to hold a child. In one hand, a bundle of birch branches for swatting. In the other, chains that he rattles in joyful menace. This is Krampus. If Odin and the Wild Hunt belong to the wide-open sky, Krampus belongs to narrow streets and village squares. His home territory is the mountainous region that stretches across modern-day Austria, southern Germany, Slovenia, and parts of neighboring countries. His season is Advent, specifically the days around December 5th and 6th, when St. Nicholas makes his rounds. Where the saint goes, Krampus often follows. In many versions of the legend, St. Nicholas is the figure we now recognize in bishop's robes, mitre on his head, crozier in his hand, beard white, demeanor calm. He visits homes or gathers children in the square, asking them if they have been good. Those who have received sweets, nuts, small toys, those who have not, are reminded that actions have consequences. Krampus is the consequence with hooves. He is the shadow to the saint's light, the living embodiment of the threat parents murmur when nothing else works. Behave, or the one with the horns will come. Do your chores, help your family, be kind, or you might find yourself facing the creature with the chains. At best, he will swat your legs with his birch rods. At worst, he will stuff you into his sack and carry you away into the mountains, where no one will hear you over the wind. On the surface, it seems like a simple bit of seasonal theatre, a moral lesson hammered home with fur and bells. But under the surface, you can feel older currents moving. Krampus looks nothing like a saint, and everything like a leftover from a very different sort of December. His goat legs and horns recall pre-Christian mountain spirits and fertility gods. His tongue and wild eyes speak of beings once believed to roam during the 12 nights of Christmas, when the veil between worlds grew thin. Some folklorists see in him a memory of household demons appeased with offerings. Others trace him to figures associated with the Wild Hunt, part of Odin's unruly retinue. Whatever his precise origin, he is a reminder that when winter came, people did not assume that only kind eyes were watching. The Church, faced with such persistent beliefs, could have tried to stamp them out completely. In some periods, it did. There are records of authorities condemning Krampus as a devil figure, banning his processions, calling his presence unchristian. But suppression rarely works for long when a character has already sunk his claws into the local imagination. So another strategy emerged. Keep him, but put him on a leash. In this version, Saint Nicholas is not threatened by Krampus. He controls him. The chains that rattle so loudly are not just for show, they are symbols of a wilder power. Brought to heel, the message becomes not "winter is full of uncontrollable horrors," but the Church has even the horrors on its side now. Krampus still frightens, but he frightens in the service of a new order. Modern celebrations of Krampusnacht, Krampus Night, keep a trace of both layers. On the evening of December 5th, costumed figures pour into the streets. Their outfits range from the carefully traditional to the nightmarishly inventive. Some wear carved wooden masks with glowing eyes and meters-long horns. Others wear suits of bells that turn every movement into a deafening clamor. They chase, they roar, they pose for photographs. In some towns, the parades are officially sanctioned spectacles. In others, they retain more of their chaotic, half-wild feel. From the outside, it can look like pure, horror-aesthetic fun. But beneath the spectacle is a kind of catharsis. The people of the valley spend most of the year playing their assigned roles: worker, parent, student, citizen. Krampusnacht offers a sanctioned moment of inversion. Those who put on the fur and mask are allowed to be frightening, unpredictable. Those who watch are allowed to scream and laugh, to be a little afraid and then safe again. This is the same logic that once drove Saturnalia in Rome and other solstice festivals across Europe. a brief flipping of the social order to relieve pressure, a reminder that the darkness exists, but also that it can be survived. When you look at Krampus from this angle, he becomes part of a much larger pattern in the hidden history of Christmas. For every symbol of light, a candle, a star, a halo, there is a shadow answering it. The two do not cancel each other out. They define each other. A very pagan Christmas would have understood that instinctively. You don't celebrate the return of the sun without acknowledging how long it has been gone. In cozy, modern living rooms, parents still sometimes joke with their children about Krampus. They show pictures, share stories, threaten lightly that the horned one might come if bedrooms aren't tidied. Those children know, on some level, that no one with hooves will truly appear at their door. But the story still works. It works because somewhere in our collective memory is the knowledge that winter is not soft, that there were times when a mistake could cost more than a scolding, that long before Santa Claus, these monsters ruled the winter in people's minds, making the snow and the cold and the hunger into something with a face. As Krampus clanks off into the night in our story, chains swinging, bells echoing down the frozen street, children slowly loosen their grip on their parents' coats. The torches recede. Laughter bubbles up. The taverns reopen their doors, letting out waves of warmth and beer-scented air. The demon has done his job. For another year, the valley has looked its fears in the face and sent them walking. And high above the village, on some narrow ledge of rock, you might imagine other eyes watching. Not horns this time, but something hungrier, older, an ogress listening to the echoes of the chains, planning her own walk through the snow. Far to the north, where winter is not a season but a ruler, there is a mountain that watches the sea. Snow lies there, long after it has melted from the lowlands. The rocks are sharp and black beneath the drifts, and the wind that comes down from the summit has teeth. In the old stories of Iceland, that mountain does not just hold ice and stone, it holds an appetite. Her name is Grýla. If Krampus is the loud, theatrical terror of crowded streets, Grýla is the quiet dread that lives in the back of a child's mind when the house is finally dark. She is an ogress, vast and heavy, with a face like weathered rock, eyes like burning coals, and ears that can pick up the sound of mischief from miles away. Some tales say she has multiple heads. Others say her nose is long enough to stir a pot without bending. All agree on one thing. She listens. While the snow piles up and the wind presses against the walls, she waits in her cave in the mountains, ears tuned to the valleys below. Each tantrum, each slammed door, each cruel word between siblings is, to her, like the ringing of a dinner bell. She collects these sounds through the year. And when Christmas draws near, she comes down. Unlike Krampus, Grýla does not bother with chains or birch branches. She carries a sack, or sometimes a great basket, and in the oldest versions of the tale, its purpose is simple. Naughty children are not just threatened with a smack on the legs. They are carried away, chopped up, and cooked in Grýla's cauldron. Her favorite stew is made, the stories say, from those who refuse to help, who disobey their parents, who shirk every chance to be useful in a world where laziness can be deadly. It is a brutal image, but brutality is what northern winters were. When food was scarce and every pair of hands mattered, "If you don't help, we all suffer," was not an abstract lesson. Grýla turned that reality into a single figure. She was the consequence of ignoring the fragile balance that kept a household alive until spring. Of course, even the most terrifying creatures rarely live alone in Christmas lore. Grýla has a family. A husband, Lwyd, is sometimes mentioned. Lazy, slumped by the fire, more comic than threatening. More importantly, she has sons, 13 of them. They are known as the Yule Lads. Once, they were as frightening as their mother. Each lad had a name that announced his particular method of torment. Window peeper, who pressed his face against the glass to startle those inside. Door slammer, who made sure no one slept peacefully during the long dark. Spoon licker and pot scraper, who waited until backs were turned to snatch the last food from pots and pans. Sausage swiper, who stole meat from smoking racks. They were creatures of inconvenience and hunger, embodiments of all the little disasters that can turn a hard winter into a desperate one. Over time, though, the Yule Lads began to soften. As Iceland modernized and childhood took on a different shape, the tales shifted. The lads kept their odd names, but their teeth were filed down. Instead of merely harassing or frightening children, they began to leave small gifts in shoes left on windowsills during the 13 nights before Christmas. A potato for the badly behaved. A treat for those who had tried to be good. Grýla stayed in the shadows, still threatening, but her sons drifted closer to the role of rough-edged elves. This is one of the most vivid examples of how a history of Christmas can be watched in motion. You can see the same figures moving along a line, from dangerous spirits of winter and hunger to stern moral enforcers, to quirky, seasonal mascots. The stories did not vanish. They adapted, keeping their shape while changing their mood. There is another figure in Grýla's household, though, who never quite lost their edge. Out in the snow, larger than any farm animal, silently padding between drifts, is the Yule Cat. If you picture an ordinary cat enlarged to monstrous size, you're close. Thick fur, long tail, eyes like lanterns. In some illustrations, he looms over farmhouses, filling the night with his bulk. In others, he is merely enormous, big enough to pounce on an adult and drag them away. He stalks the countryside during the holiday season, peering into houses, sniffing at doorways. He is not hunting the lazy exactly, he is hunting the unlucky. According to the tradition, anyone who had not received new clothes before Christmas, was in danger of being eaten by the Yule Cat. On the surface, this is one of the strangest conditions in all of Christmas lore, somewhere between fashion rule and supernatural threat. It sounds almost absurd, but consider the social logic behind it. In a community where cloth was precious and clothing was often made by a hand, giving new garments at midwinter was not just generosity. It was a sign that the person receiving them belonged, that they were being looked after, that no one in the household was forgotten. Children who worked hard, helping with shearing, spinning, weaving, might be first to earn that new piece of clothing. Those who shirked might go without. The story of the Yule Cat turns that difference into a matter of life and death. It is not really the cat that is frightening. It is the idea of being the one person in the community who stands out as uncared for. The tale pushes people toward a collective responsibility. Make sure everyone has something new to wear, or you risk drawing the monster's attention. As with so many elements in a very pagan Christmas, fear and solidarity intertwine. The threat of being devoured becomes a reason to share. Viewed together, Grýla, the Yule lads, and the Yule Cat form a whole system. Grýla polices laziness and disobedience. The lads patrol the margins of hunger and mischief. The cat enforces community care. They are not random bogeymen thrown into the season for fun. They are the way a small, precarious society taught itself how to survive icy months on a volcanic rock in the North Atlantic. When we watch gentle snow fall outside our windows now, with electric lights glowing and supermarkets stocked to the ceiling, it's hard to feel the same urgency. The mountain no longer feels like a mouth. The winter no longer feels like a judge. But the stories remain. In Iceland today, Grýla appears on postcards and decorations, her once terrifying face rendered almost grandmotherly in some styles, monstrous in others. The Yule lads visit children in full costume, handing out sweets in shopping centers and at festivals. The Yule Cat has become a beloved, if still eerie, national symbol. In Reykjavik, a huge illuminated version of him sometimes looks out over the city during Advent, glowing gold against the dark. It is tempting to see this as a complete domestication, the last stage in the journey before Santa Claus. These monsters ruled the winter. Now they star in cartoons. But listen to the way people still talk about them. There is pride in the strangeness and a kind of respect. They are evidence that the island's Christmas lore is not just imported, not just borrowed from a global template. It has its own teeth, even if they don't bite as often. If the hidden history of Christmas is a puzzle, Grýla and her household are one of the most important pieces. They show how stories can hold onto the memory of real fear. Even as they're smoothed into entertainment, they remind us that behind the cookie tins and the gift wrap, winter once demanded obedience, effort, and care. As Grýla trudges back up the mountain in our tale, sack empty for another year, her sons trailing behind her and the huge cat bringing up the rear. The valley below glows with scattered lights. Families gather indoors, pulling on freshly knitted sweaters, sipping something warm. Children are a little better behaved than usual. Not perfectly, just enough. In the morning, they will find small gifts in their shoes. And somewhere, in another part of Europe, another kind of creature is waking, stretching its crooked limbs and preparing to crawl up from under the world now that Christmas has cracked open the year. In the heat of a Mediterranean summer, the idea of winter monsters can feel distant. But even in lands of olive trees and whitewashed villages, December has its own darkness. The days grow shorter, the winds shift, carrying the taste of snow down from distant mountains. Fires burn more brightly in hearths, and in some corners of Greece and the Balkans, people still remember the time when, between Christmas and Epiphany, the ground itself was said to open. Beneath the earth, far below the deepest roots, there was a tree. Not a tree as you or I know it, with branches stretching toward the light, but an inverted thing, its roots tangled in whatever lay at the very bottom of the world. Its trunk held everything together. If it ever fell, the story said, the world would end. Down there in the dark, half mad with boredom and malice, lived the Calicantseroi. They were goblins, small, twisted, soot-black creatures with long fingers and longer appetites. All year long, they hacked at the tree with rusty saws and dull axes, trying to bring it down. Chips of wood flew through the stale air. They strained and cursed and laughed, convinced that with just a little more effort, they could cut through the trunk and watch everything above them collapse. But every December, just as they were about to succeed, something happened. Christmas. The world above burst into life, bells ringing, churches glowing, animals restless in their stalls, people moving in patterns the goblins could almost, but not quite, remember. The noise rose all the way down to their miserable cavern. It shook dust from the ceiling. It scratched at whatever was left of their memories from when they might have lived on the surface. And they forgot the tree. Leaving their work half-finished, the Calicantseroi scrambled up towards the sound. They wriggled through cracks in the stone. They climbed wells and crawled up chimneys, smearing soot. They pulled themselves out from under floorboards and squeezed through keyholes. Suddenly, the world was not a solid, stable place. It was porous, and out of its pores, for 12 nights, came chaos. Once loose, the goblins did what goblins do best. They spoiled food, turned milk sour, tangled hair, frightened animals, and caused minor injuries in kitchens just when hands were already tired. They danced on rooftops, shouted obscene jokes down chimneys, and rode stray dogs through the streets like stolen horses. They toppled carts, stole sausages, made doors swell so they wouldn't quite close. They didn't bring apocalypse. That was what they were trying to do to the tree. Up here they brought something more familiar. They brought inconvenience. In a world already stressed by winter, short tempers, tight supplies, sleepless nights, these small disasters could feel like an assault. So people developed defenses. They hung protective charms over doorways. They burned special incense. Some sprinkled the floor with grain, so the Kalikantsaroi would be distracted, forced to count each seed before causing trouble. Others left a bit of food out to appease them, hoping that a full belly would make a goblin less destructive. The church had its own answer. On Epiphany, priests moved from house to house, blessing water and sprinkling it on walls, thresholds, and family members. This ritual cleansing, combined with the completion of the 12 holy days, was said to drive the Kalikantsaroi back below ground. When they returned to their tree, they always found it miraculously healed, the cuts gone, the trunk whole again. Furious, they would pick up their tools and begin hacking once more, convinced that this year they would finally succeed. In terms of pure narrative, it is one of the most elegant cycles in Christmas lore. The world is always almost ending. Winter brings it to the brink. Short days, cold nights, the sense that everything might be slipping off the edge, underground. The goblins share that desire to see it all fall apart. But the very festival that seems to invite them out, the noisy, bright, liminal period between Christmas and Epiphany, is also what saves the world, because it distracts them at the crucial moment. Beneath the comedy of these chaotic little beings is a deeper theme. Things break down at the edges of the year. Routines weaken, rules blur, people drink more, stay up later, travel when they might not otherwise travel, gather in houses that are overcrowded and overheated. Mistakes happen. Tempers flare, gear snaps, pies burn, pipes freeze. When societies feel that breakdown, they often imagine it as something external. Goblins, demons, mischief makers. It's easier to say, the Kalikantsaroi did it, than we are tired and the world is fragile. At the same time, the rituals to keep them at bay, charms, prayers, careful hospitality, serve as reminders to pay attention. Check your doors. Mind the fire. Don't leave children unsupervised near the well. What looks like superstition is also a kind of community checklist disguised as story. In the broader tapestry of a history of Christmas, the Kalikantsaroi show how even comparatively warm climates needed their winter monsters. The cold might not be as lethal as in the north, but uncertainty thrives in any season. So people let a little chaos out of the basement for 12 nights, gave it names and faces, and then ceremonially sent it back. Today, in villages where the stories are still told, the goblins have softened a bit, as monsters do. They appear in children's books with rounder features, more mischief than menace. Some regions stage playful performances where youths dress up as Kalikantsaroi, rattling doors and shouting before being chased off. The old fear has become a theatrical thrill. but the structure remains. The 12 days are still liminal. Fireworks and feasts still blur the line between one year and the next. Prayers are still said over water, and beneath the floorboards of imagination, the goblins still hack at the tree. It is another strand in the hidden history of Christmas, that the season is not just about a single holy night, but about a stretch of time when the ordinary rules loosen and people negotiate with the forces of disorder in symbolic form. Up in Iceland, an ogress rolls over in her sleep. In the Alps, a demon hangs his mask on a nail. In the Mediterranean, the last goblin squeezes back through a crack in the stone, grumbling, leaving muddy footprints on the edge of a well. Somewhere further west, on a coastline battered by winter winds, another being stirs. It is not content to slip through cracks or lurk in caves. It likes the open, the direct approach. It likes to come to the front door and knock with bone. Imagine it is late. The feast is finished. The plates have been stacked in the sink to be dealt with tomorrow. Candles have burned low, dripping wax on the tablecloth. The fire has settled into a red sigh of coals. Outside, the night is wet and cold, the sort of winter evening that slides under doors and up sleeves. You are just about to close the curtains when you hear it. Not a storm, not the distant hiss of passing cars. Something closer. Bells, maybe. Footsteps sloshing in the mud. Voices, half muffled by scarves and song. And then, unmistakably, a knock at the door, firm, insistent. When you open it, you do not see Krampus or a goblin or a kindly saint. You see a horse's skull. Its bone is white against the dark. Glass or real eyes gleam in the hollow sockets. Ribbons stream from its head. A long sheet, often white, often embroidered, hides the person whose arm holds the pole that supports it. Around it cluster figures in heavy coats and hats, some with accordions or drums, cheeks pink with cold and drink. This is the Mari Lwyd, the grey mare, and she has come to visit. The tradition belongs to parts of Wales where winter comes with rain as much as snow, and where Christmas lore has always been touched with a hint of the uncanny. The Mari is a kind of walking paradox. She is a symbol of death. Nothing is more obviously dead than a bare skull, and yet she is also an emblem of persistence, of bones that don't rot, of spirits that won't stay buried. Her visits happen between Christmas and New Year, in that same liminal stretch when the Calle roam elsewhere and when the wild hunt might be heard in the wind. The procession carrying her moves from house to house, sometimes announced in advance, sometimes a welcome surprise. At each door, a ritual unfolds. It begins with song. The party outside sings a verse, often in Welsh, asking for entry, for food, drink, hospitality. The people inside sing back, refusing, citing lack of space or supplies or readiness. This call and response can go on for some time, turning into a kind of improvised, poetic duel called a poncio. Each side tries to outdo the other with witty rhymes and good-natured insults. Laughter follows the best lines. Children peek around adults' legs to watch the skull bob and nod, its jaw snapping open and shut. Eventually, tradition dictates that the household gives in. The door opens wider. The Mari Lwyd and her companions are invited inside. Once over the threshold, the skull might chase people playfully, snapping its jaws near their shoulders, or wander curiously from room to room. Food and drink are shared. Blessings for good luck in the coming year are given, sometimes spoken, sometimes implied, in the simple act of inclusion. Then the mayor and her company move on to the next house, leaving behind a buzz of excitement and a slightly unsettling memory. Death itself came knocking, and you invited it in for cake. From a distance, this can all seem charmingly strange, an odd local custom perfect for documentaries with titles like A Very Pagan Christmas. But up close, you can sense the deeper layers at work. Winter has always been the season when mortality feels nearest. Illness spreads more easily in close quarters. Old and frail bodies struggle with the cold. The year's cycle ends. People take stock of who is missing from the table. To simply ignore that would be to deny reality. To wallow in it would be unbearable. The Mari Lwyd walks the line. She is frightening enough to make the visit exciting. Children squeal. Adults chuckle with a nervous edge. But she is also controlled. She only comes when carried by neighbors. She only enters when invited. She does not stay. She is, in a sense, tamed death, acknowledged, mocked, included, and then gently escorted out. Some folklorists trace her roots to older fertility rites, where horses were sacred and their bones preserved as charms. Others see in her a folk version of Mama's plays, those roving performances that once entertained villagers during winter, with comedy and rough drama. Whatever her precise ancestry, she now stands as one of the clearest examples of how the hidden history of Christmas involves not just joy, but the ritual handling of fear. There is also something quietly radical about the way the Mari Lwyd tradition treats the boundary between inside and outside. So many winter monsters try to cross that line violently. Grýla, forcing her way in to seize children, goblins slipping through cracks, wolves testing the latch on the gate. The Mari comes openly, knocks and waits. She does not demand. She negotiates in rhyme. The people inside are not helpless. They can spar, delay, refuse when they finally open the door. It is not out of surrender, but out of choice. Hospitality in that moment becomes a kind of magic stronger than fright. When you watch modern recordings of the Mari Lwyd making her rounds, plastic eyes lit with tiny bulbs, skull carefully preserved and cleaned, carriers laughing under the sheet, you can see how the tradition continues to adapt. Electric streetlights shine on the scene now. Phones record every moment. The houses are more insulated, the tables more plentifully spread. But the feeling is still there. The night is still cold. The year, Holle, is still ending. Something in all of us still recognizes the shiver that runs up the spine when bone grins from the darkness and song asks to come in. By the time the Mari Lwyd disappears into the rain at the end of our chapter, led away by her keepers, the village she has visited feels somehow cleaner, not because anything has literally been washed, but because something has been faced. The fear of loss, the awareness of fragility. The skull has danced in the kitchen and left again. And as the door closes for the last time that night, the household settles back into its pool of light, a little more aware of the dark beyond the glass. High above, clouds move across the moon. In other valleys, other beings stir. A woman with two faces checks spinning wheels. A witch gathers gifts for children she has never met. A tall figure in red adjusts the harnesses of unseen reindeer. The winter stage is almost full, and soon another actor will walk out onto it. Not a monster this time, but a visitor who carries pieces of them all. Not all winter visitors arrive with horns or bare bone. Some slip in like a draft through the cracks of the house. Some stand in the doorway like an aunt you're not sure you should hug or fear. Some look, at first, like ordinary old women, bent from years at the hearth, hands roughened by wool and water. Only when you look closer do you see that their eyes gleam with something that is not just age. In the Alpine regions of Central Europe, people once said that during the 12 nights after Christmas, a woman walked. She had many names, but the one that stuck most firmly was Perchta, or Perchta, the Bright One. Her brightness was not the sweet glow of tinsel and fairy lights. It was the harsh light of inspection. Perchta was a lady of the domestic sphere, ruler not of armies or storms, but of spinning rooms and kitchens. She came to see whether the work of winter had been done. All year, households labored to turn raw wool and flax into thread and cloth. Spinning was not a hobby. It was survival. Without it, there would be no fresh clothes for the Yule Cat to check, no sturdy garments to keep out the cold. By the time the 12 nights came, the work should have been finished, the distaffs empty, the hanks of thread neatly wound. Perchta knew. In some stories, she walked silently from house to house, slipping through keyholes or gliding down chimneys. In others, she arrived with a noisy retinue of spirits, a version of the Wild Hunt, translated into a women's procession. However she came, her task was the same: to look at the spinning, the cleanliness, the order of the household. If everything was as it should be, Perchta could be generous. Good children might find a small silver coin in their shoes. Diligent spinners might receive blessings for the coming year. She was bright, after all, associated with clear skies, shining snow, the crisp air of a cold day when everything feels sharply defined. But if things were not in order, her brightness turned cutting. The most frightening tales said that Perchta would punish the lazy and the gluttonous in a way that feels straight out of a nightmare. She would slit open their bellies as they slept, scoop out whatever they had overeaten, and stuff the cavity with straw and stones before sewing them back up. In the morning, they would look the same on the outside, but inside they would be wrong. It is a gruesome image, one that lingers, yet even here, symbolism whispers. A belly full of straw is the belly of a cow, a beast of burden. A belly full of stones is a body weighed down, unable to move or grow. Perchta's worst punishments turn people into what they have allowed themselves to become: inert, stuffed, unnaturally still in a season that demands effort. Like Grýla, she is a story about the cost of doing nothing when everything depends on doing something. Close to Perchta, in the web of Christmas lore, is another figure, Frau Holle, or Mother Hulda. Holle is softer on the surface. In some German tales, she lives in a well, in others beyond a snow-filled gate. She watches over industrious girls, rewarding those who work hard with showers of gold, punishing those who are lazy with tar or other misfortune. When she shakes out her feather beds, people say, "Snow falls in the world above." Here, the winter witch is almost a grandmother of weather itself. Her housekeeping is literal climate. Her approval brings reward. Her displeasure, hardship. Again, the message is clear. Work matters. The quiet labor of spinning and sewing and tending the home is not invisible. It is linked to the very rhythm of the world. Further south, in Italy, another winter woman rides the sky. La Befana travels on the night before Epiphany, January 6th. She is a witch by appearance. Nose long, clothes patched, broom between her legs, but her role is closer to that of a kindly but stern grandmother. Children hang stockings for her. If they have been good, she fills them with sweets and small gifts. If not, she leaves coal. Her origin story blends Christian and older elements. One tale says that when the Magi were following the star to find the infant Christ, they stopped at Befana's house and invited her to come. Too busy with her sweeping, she declined. Later, regretting her decision, she set out to search for the child herself, bringing gifts. Unable to find him, she left presents for every child she met, just in case. In that sense, she is forever on a quest she can't complete, driven by a mixture of guilt and generosity. But before that story wrapped itself around her, she was likely another household spirit, a guardian of the hearth, a personification of the winter visitor who checks on whether tasks have been finished and children cared for. Perchta, Holle, La Befana, three faces of the same idea. Winter is not only fought in the open, with hunts and bonfires, it is also fought indoors, with spinning wheels and brooms, with pots scrubbed clean to keep sickness away, with order imposed on chaos in small, repeated acts. The women who did that work were rarely praised in official histories, but in a very pagan Christmas, they were honored indirectly through these figures. The witches of winter are the mirror images of the housewives, powerful, feared, essential. When Christianity came, it did what it so often did with such characters. It folded them into its own calendar without entirely smoothing away their edges. Perchta's period of activity became tied to the 12 days of Christmas. Holle's snow shaking could be read as divine providence. La Befana's gift-giving was linked to the story of the Christ child, yet the underlying lesson, work, care, and share, or face consequences, remained. These winter ladies also prepare the stage for someone else. They check lists, they reward and punish. They move through the night on specific dates, leaving small gifts or reminders. They are, in their way, prototypes for a later visitor whose list-making would become legendary. When we speak of the hidden history of Christmas and trace a history of Christmas characters from darkness into light, it is easy to skip from wild gods to modern Santa in a single leap. But in the middle of that arc walk, these women, broom in hand, distaff under arm, skirts wet from snow. They do not fly as fast as reindeer. They do not have a workshop at the North Pole. They have something older, the authority of those who kept the hearth alive when the wind was howling. As Befana shakes the ashes from her broom, and Perchta counts the last spindles of thread at the end of our chapter, the shape of the coming change is already visible. The world is moving toward a single figure who will eventually gather all these judging, gift-giving, sky-riding traits into one. Before he arrives, one more transformation has to happen. The many must become one. If you were to take a piece of parchment and start drawing the figures we've met so far, layering them one over another, you would notice something strange. Odin, on his 8-legged horse, bearded and cloaked, riding the winter sky. Saint Nicholas in his bishop's robes, carrying gifts for children. Krampus, chained and controlled, doling out punishment while the saint gives rewards. Grýla listening from her mountain. The Yule lads slipping in to leave things in shoes. Perchta checking work. La Befana sweeping through the stars with a sack over her shoulder. At first, the drawing would look chaotic, a crowd of overlapping shapes. But if you kept working, softening a horn here, shortening a nose there, hiding a scar with a smile, you might find that all of them could be persuaded to share a single outline. A man who travels in winter, a visitor from the beyond, a judge of behavior, a giver of gifts. Santa did not appear out of nowhere. In a history of Christmas told honestly, he comes out of this slow process of layering and editing. The early Christian church promoted the figure of Saint Nicholas of Myra, a 4th-century bishop Known for his generosity, stories of him secretly providing dowries for poor girls, giving coins to children, and working miracles made him a favorite across Europe. His feast day, December 6th, became a time for small gifts and charity. In the Low Countries, this saint blended with local customs to become Sinterklaas, a tall figure in red bishop's garments who arrived by horse or boat, accompanied by helpers bringing sweets and sometimes discipline. In England, Father Christmas developed as a personification of midwinter festivity, robed, bearded, more about feasting than theology. Meanwhile, the older, wilder stories never fully died. People still whispered about riders in the sky. They still joked about witches and goblins and ogres. In some regions, these beings walked side by side with the saint. In others, they retreated into children's games and ghost stories, overshadowed by more respectable, church-approved imagery. Then came the age of print. Poets and illustrators in the 18th and 19th centuries began to shape these overlapping figures into a more recognizable character. In 1823, an American poem commonly known as "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" depicted Saint Nicholas as a jolly, pipe-smoking visitor, arriving in a sleigh pulled by 8 reindeer, slipping down chimneys with a sack of toys. He was smaller than later versions, more elfin, but the core was there. Nocturnal journey, gifts, list of good and bad. Artists seized on the image. Throughout the 19th century, drawings in newspapers and magazines gradually enlarged him, rounded his belly, and settled him into the fur-trimmed, hooded figure we know. European traditions filtered into the American version and bounced back across the ocean, influencing Father Christmas and Sinterklaas in turn. By the time the 20th century rolled in, a kind of consensus had formed. There would be one main winter visitor now. He would carry many names: Santa Claus, Father Christmas, Père Noël, the Christmas Man, but his look would be surprisingly consistent: red or fur-lined clothing, white beard, twinkling eyes. He would keep the saint's generosity, the rider's sky journey, the witch's gift-giving, the monster's moral accounting, and he would be safe. That last part is crucial in smoothing Santa into a friendly, universal figure. Modern culture sanded off the sharper edges of the old stories. No more gut-slitting witches or child-eating ogres in the living room. No more threat of being stuffed into a sack and carried off. The worst that could happen now was a stocking filled with coal, or the absence of a desired toy. You can see why this version spread so easily. He fit perfectly into a world that was becoming more urban, more commercial, more focused on childhood as a protected phase of life. He helped sell the idea of Christmas as a family-centered holiday rather than a rowdy public festival. He was easy to put on adverts and greeting cards. Companies were quick to use his image. One particularly famous series of soft drink advertisements in the mid-1900s helped standardize his look further, embedding him in global consciousness. From a certain angle, it seems like a complete triumph. The chaotic cast of winter monsters has been replaced with a single, lovable icon. The season's story has a main character everyone recognizes. Yet look a little closer, and you can still see the older beings peeking through the seams. Santa flies through the sky, visiting every home in a single night like a god on his round. He keeps a list of who's been good or bad, like Perchta going over her spinning, like Krampus asking pointed questions in the square. He rewards those who follow the rules, withholds from those who don't. He is benevolent, but not entirely toothless. He is, in a way, the domesticated king of a very old wild court. The phrase, "before Santa Claus, these monsters ruled the winter," is not just a catchy line, it is a statement about power. For centuries, fear and respect were scattered among many winter figures, each with their own domain. As society centralized and the church and later commerce stepped in, that network of stories thinned into a single, centralized narrative. Santa took the throne not just by replacing the monsters, but by absorbing their functions. Of course, stories are never entirely obedient. While Santa's image sat perched atop the official version of the holiday, the darker tales kept moving underneath. Parents still told their children about Krampus in Alpine villages. Icelanders still warned each other, half seriously, about the Yule Cat. Welsh communities revived the Mari Lwyd. Italian children left sweets for La Befana. New generations grew up with Christmas horror films and Gothic novels set in snowy landscapes. The throne, it turns out, is crowded. If you were to write a truly complete hidden history of Christmas, it would have to be a story of compromise. A saint and a god and a demon and a witch all agreeing grudgingly to share the same season, a culture torn between wanting its winter comforting and wanting it honest. The result is the strange blend we live with now. Children write letters to Santa while watching movies about monsters in the snow. Shopping centers pipe in cheerful music while selling ornaments shaped like Krampus. Documentaries explore a very pagan Christmas, while streaming alongside animated specials about reindeer and elves. The old and the new, the dark and the bright, sit side by side like guests uneasy at the same table. And perhaps that is fitting. Winter has always been about contradiction, life and death, hunger and feasting, solitude and crowded rooms. It makes sense that the figures who walk through it would carry that contradiction too. As Santa tightens his belt in our story, preparing for another night's journey, you can imagine all the eyes on him. Odin's one eye, watching from some high, forgotten place, Krampus's yellow gaze from the mouth of an alley, Grýla's ember stare from the cave, Perchta's cool appraisal from the spinning room, La Befana's sharp glint from a distant rooftop. They have not vanished. They have simply stepped back to let him stand under the spotlight. The question, as we reach our final chapter, is why we keep quietly inviting them back in. Think again of the opening image. Snow falling slowly under a street lamp. The smell of cinnamon and pine. A mother or grandmother in the kitchen. The soft clatter of plates being stacked. Children singing carols at a door. Cheeks red, breath clouding in the air. Lights in windows, warm and steady. On the surface, it is pure comfort. A postcard. A scene that could be lifted from almost any modern celebration and pinned under the label holiday spirit. Yet when you close your eyes and let the feeling of it sink in, you may notice something else at the edges. The dark beyond the circle of light. The sense that the night outside the glass is immense and cold. The faint, irrational prickle along your neck when the wind changes, as if something is turning its head. The season has always had both. For thousands of years, people have met winter not just with joy, but with stories of what waits in the dark. A history of Christmas that leaves out that tension feels incomplete. It is like a hymn with all the minor notes erased. Why, though, do we keep telling the monster stories even now? We no longer truly believe that Grýla will come down from the mountain to scoop up disobedient children. We can explain the sound of a storm without invoking the Wild Hunt. We know that the skull at the door has a neighbor under the sheet, not death itself. Most of us, if we are honest, understand that Santa will not withhold gifts because of one bad day in June. And yet the tales persist, repeated in whispers and documentaries and long, late-night videos that people click on when they can't sleep. Parents still joke about Krampus, kids still dare each other to look up pictures of the Yule Cat in the dark. Festivals revive old processions. Viewers search out Christmas lore, eager not just for tinsel, but for tales. Part of the answer is simple. The stories are good. They are vivid. They tap into deep images. Horns against snow, chains in the fog, a horse's skull in a doorway, a witch on a broom silhouetted against stars. They give December color beyond red and green. But there is more. Winter strips the world down. Trees bare, gardens empty, days short. In that stripped-down landscape, certain truths are harder to avoid. That we are mortal, that resources are finite, that our lives are more fragile than we pretend, that the line between safety and danger is thinner than a pane of glass. Monsters are ways of talking about those truths without having to look directly at them. Krampus is fear of punishment wrapped in fur and bells. Grýla is the specter of neglect and hunger given a face. The Yule Cat is the terror of being left out, unloved, exposed. The Kalikanzaroi are the breakdowns at the edges of our routines. Perchta is the dread that our work will never be enough. The Mari Lwyd is death-knocking, politely La Befana is regret, turned into an endless journey. Santa himself, for all his cheer, carries the idea of judgment, of a list kept somewhere, of actions tallied. When we gather around a fire or a screen in the long nights and listen to these stories, we are doing something our ancestors did before us. We are acknowledging that beneath the lights and the cooking smells and the music, there is still a world where bad things happen, where winters still take their toll, where not everyone makes it through unscathed. But we are also asserting something else, that we can talk about those fears together and survive them. It is easier to say, "Who'll behave" or "Krampus will come," than to lecture a child on societal cohesion and risk management. It is easier to watch a video about "Before Santa came, winter belonged to monsters" than to stare out at a dark sky and think about our own smallness. Story turns fear into something we can pass around, examine, even enjoy. This is the hidden history of Christmas under all the wrapping paper, a human attempt to negotiate with winter, not just the weather, but everything. Winter symbolizes loss, change, the end of cycles, the uncertainty of what comes next. In that negotiation, monsters have an important role. They remind us that our actions matter, even when we're tired. That kindness and effort ripple outward. That neglect and cruelty have consequences. They personify the feeling of being watched, not by cameras or neighbors, but by the season itself, by the stories we tell about ourselves. At the same time, the rituals that tame them, chains on Krampus, songs with the Mari Lwyd, offerings for goblins, gifts for children, remind us that community is stronger than fear. The monsters are frightening alone. In procession, in story, in festivals, they become part of a shared language. On a personal level, there is another reason we keep them close. Winter is reflective. When the year turns, people take stock of what went right, what went wrong, who is still here, who is missing. In that quiet reckoning, it can help to imagine that there are beings out there conducting their own accounting, that Odin rides, that Perchta inspects, that Santa flips through his book. It gives shape to the vague urge to be better, to repair, to make amends. A very pagan Christmas would have been blunt about this. The gods and spirits judged, and you accepted the verdict. Modern celebrations, softened by centuries of theology and advertising, often shy away from explicit judgment, preferring an uncomplicated glow. But the old stories still flow underneath, offering a different flavor for those who seek it. So here we are, in our warm rooms of light and sound. Snow or rain or dry cold lies outside, depending on where we live. Somewhere, distant bells ring. Maybe a child in an Alpine town is being told not to stay out late because Krampus is about. Maybe in Reykjavik, a huge Yule Cat made of lights watches over the square. Maybe in a Welsh village, a group of singers is adjusting a horse's skull, ready to knock on the first door. Maybe in an Italian city, a child is hanging a stocking, thinking more of a witch than a man in red. And maybe, somewhere else, Someone is pressing play on a long story about all of them, leaning back, closing their eyes, letting the names and images wash over them like falling snow. In doing so, they are joining a line of listeners that stretches back through centuries. People huddled around bonfires as storms raged, families in longhouses whispering about riders in the sky, villagers in the Alps listening for chains, fishermen in Iceland glancing up at the mountains, girls at spinning wheels looking over their shoulders for Perchta, children in stone cottages listening for the knock of bone on wood. Before Santa came, winter belonged to monsters. Now, the season belongs to both. The man in red flies his route above a world that still hums with older stories. The monsters appear in festivals, in books, in videos that call themselves Christmas documentaries and seasonal mysteries, in the quiet corners of a holiday that is bigger than any single creed. And as you sit in your own pool of light, listening, maybe you can feel what they all have in common. Not just fear, not just joy, but the simple, stubborn, human desire to face the longest night with something more than silence, with tales of riders and witches and skulls and saints, all walking together through the snow, reminding us that we have been here before and that we made it through. The wind rises, the fire burns low. Somewhere in the distance, a door closes. Another winter story has been told.